Today I'm going to show you a super easy way to make sourdough bread. You can do all sorts of variations. We've put some of the most fun ingredients inside our sourdough bread. Fruits, chocolate chips, herbs, seasonings, pie filling, and we've also made cookies and waffles with our sourdough start. So this is how you do. Now this is for a big batch. Keep in mind, this was making enough for, I think I ended up making about 8 loaves of sourdough bread. So I will put the recipe in the video description here on my blog, so you can go and see the measurements for depending on how much bread you wanted to make. But for this, I'm starting, this is my activated sourdough starter, so it has been fed. And if you're just learning with sourdough start, basically when you get your sourdough start out of the fridge, you have to feed it with equal parts of flour and water and equal parts to the sourdough starter. You are going to want a food scale. It will be your best friend. You want to weigh everything. So you feed it and then you wait 4 to 6 hours, and then it's as long as it's doubled up in size and gotten bubbly, it's considered active. So here I have my active start. I've weighed it so I know how much the start is. And now for the bread recipe, it takes a certain amount of water and flour. This isn't a 1-to-1 ratio like it is when you feed your start. So it's a little bit different. And again, the measurements, the ratios and amounts are going to be a little bit different depending on how much start you're using and how many loaves of sourdough bread you want to make. Again, this was for a large batch. So this made about 8 loaves. So, anyhow, and I try to stay as close as possible. Now this is in grams. My scale there is weighing in grams. I try to stay within 2 to 4 grams of where I should be. If you accidentally get a little bit more, you can always take a little bit of the water out, or like I do here, okay, I was trying to get it right at 3,000 and just get it as close as possible. And you can sometimes, as the machine sits, it will adjust, and you'll notice your grams, your ratios may adjust on the scale a little bit. So that's why I don't worry if it's too drastically off by 2 to 4 grams less or more. Now because this is a big batch, I was using the flour bag, and because we needed quite a bit of flour here. And be sure to reset your scale between each ingredient you add. That way you know exactly how much is going on. Same thing goes for when you add your bowl to the scale when it's empty. Reset the scale, because remember, your bowl will also have a standard weight. And so you don't want to be counting that bowl weight as part of your start or your flour or water. The great thing about sourdough bread is it's super simple and minimal ingredients. Literally, it's flour, water, and salt. And so now that we've got our water and our flour added to our sourdough start, we're going to mix it in a little bit. I just like to mix it with a spoon, just enough to get it somewhat incorporated. And then we're going to add our salt. So you can see I left my spoon in there, but then I reset the scale. So the scale technically is counting the weight of my spoon right now. So, which is fine as long as I don't take the spoon out before I start weighing anything next. So then you're weighing your salt, how much your salt you're adding to the recipe. And then at this point, once you get your salt in, you're just going to continue to stir with a spoon, and eventually it gets to a point where I think it's just easier to use my hands. So I will dig my hands in and start stirring with those. Once you get your dough all stirred together, I've got it sped up here because it does take a little bit of muscle work, and definitely remember you want a big bowl. Now your dough is going to raise at least double, so you do want to have a big enough bowl that it has room to raise inside the bowl. So you're doing this the night before, by the way. You're going to let it raise overnight. So sourdough bread is definitely not a quick bread. It is something you have to have a little bit of planning and time for. It's really easy, but it's just one of those things you do a section, you do a part of it, and then you leave it, and then you come back a few hours later and do the next step. So it's, like I said, it's something you have to plan for a little bit. Once you get it all done with your hands, take your scraper tool here. This tool is so handy, and just scrape the edges. You don't want any of the sourdough stuff left on the edges because they'll dry and they'll get all crusty. Wrap it with saran wrap, let it sit out overnight. So this definitely, you want the saran wrap, and you don't want the sides to have the dough in it because they'll get crusty. Then you'll have like hard chunks in your dough and your bread the next day. Definitely don't want that. So now, the next morning, you saw how big and it had raised and doubled overnight. So next morning, we're going to take a little bit of dough. It is pretty sticky, so you'll want to use plenty of flour on your hands, plenty on the counter, all that, because it will be a pretty sticky dough, and that's fine. So what I do is I just work it here for a little bit until you can get it where it's not sticking to your fingers. I'll add a little bit of flour in here and there, and you just work it like this, and then when it gets to a workable point where it's not sticking too bad, I pick it up and I'll fold it under from the outside underneath the bottom, and you just fold it and make a nice round shaped loaf, and then put it on some parchment paper and set it aside and do your next loaf. And then you go from there and you just repeat the process, doing all the loaves and setting them aside on the parchment paper. So also at this point, when you're doing this stage, if you wanted to add any fillings into your sourdough bread, this is when you would do them. So you can roll in, I've done cinnamon sugar and cinnamon chips. I've done blueberry pie filling. That was really good. Freeze-dried fruits work really well, and you don't have to rehydrate. They rehydrate when they bake. We've done herbs, we've done cheeses. There's a lot of different variations you can do. You can add things into the sourdough bread at this point if you want. So I do this while my oven's getting hot. So now that, because the oven, it takes quite a while for the oven to get up to temperature. Before you put them in the oven, you have your cast iron pans in the oven, you want those to heat up with the oven. So you spray your sourdough bread there. You want to cover the top really good, spray it really good with water. That's going to give it a nice chewy crust. And so now this one, I forgot to score, but you do want to score the top of your loaf just ever so slightly. Run a knife across the top. You can do whatever design you want. I usually just do like 3 lines across the top. Put your lid on your Dutch oven or cast iron pan, and then you're going to time it for 20 minutes. So the best times I found is 20 minutes with the lid on, and then when the timer goes off, just take the lid off the pan and put it back in do another 15 minutes, and that'll let it get golden on top. That's been, for me, the best time. Doesn't really matter what size loaf of bread I'm making, anything like that. That seems to work really well. So after the 15 minutes, just pull out the parchment paper, and so I put the parchment paper, all that, with the bread. So pull it all out, and there you have, look at that gorgeous sourdough bread. Now spray your next one. You don't want to spray it ahead of time. You want to spray it right before it goes in. Otherwise your paper will get soggy and soft and it'll rip. So you want to kind of use the paper to set it in the pan. Put your next one in and set your timer and do the process again. So you're just going to, if you only have one Dutch oven or cast iron pan, you're going to just do this. It's going to take 35 minutes for each loaf, which really isn't too bad. And there you have it. You have your nice sourdough bread. And like I said, you can do all sorts of different creations with it. So I hope you have fun with it.